I don't know why I thought it was a good idea. Maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I was just stupid. But I can tell you now, camping in a graveyard is not the kind of thing you do for fun. It was late September, and I had some time off work. I had been doing a lot of solo camping lately, mostly in forests and remote areas where I wouldn't run into anyone. I liked the isolation, the quiet. I liked feeling like I was the only person in the world. I was looking for a new spot to set up for the night, and I remembered an old graveyard about 10 miles outside town. It wasn't one of those well-kept places with headstones standing in neat rows. This was an abandoned burial ground, mostly overgrown, forgotten, and barely mentioned by anyone. I had passed by it a few times while hiking and figured it could be an interesting spot. I wasn't thinking about ghosts. I don't believe in that, but I did have a weird feeling about the place. The kind of feeling that makes your stomach twist, even though you can't explain why. I should have listened to that feeling. I packed light, just my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight. The hike wasn't long, maybe an hour, but by the time I reached the graveyard, the sky was already turning orange with the setting sun. The place was worse than I remembered. The graves were barely visible, most of the headstones broken or covered in moss. Some had sunk into the earth. The ground was uneven, filled with dips and hollows where the land had shifted over time. I walked around, looking for a flat spot to set up my tent. I tried not to step directly on the graves, but it was impossible to avoid them completely. The whole place felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I shook it off and pitched my tent near the edge of the cemetery, where a few trees gave me some cover. It was a good spot, out of the wind, and with enough open space around me to see if anyone or anything came too close. I started a small fire with the dry wood I had collected earlier and sat down to eat. By the time it got dark, the fire was the only source of light around me. There was no moon, no streetlights, nothing but the flickering glow of the flames. The shadows between the graves stretched long and dark, and the air felt colder than it should have. I didn't like the way the graveyard looked at night. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the silence. In the woods, you hear things at night. Crickets, owls, the wind moving through the trees. But here there was nothing, just dead air. I sat by the fire for a while, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the setting get to me. But I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every time I turned my head, I felt like I had just missed seeing something move. I finished eating, put out the fire, and climbed into my tent. It was cold inside, colder than it should have been. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, trying to sleep. It didn't work. I wasn't scared. I told myself that over and over, but my body wasn't listening. My heart was beating too fast, my muscles tense like I was waiting for something. I turned onto my side, trying to get comfortable, but no matter what I did, I couldn't relax. That's when I heard it. Faint sound. Not a voice, not an animal. A soft shifting of earth. Like something heavy was moving just outside my tent. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Just silence again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the ground settled, or a rock shifted somewhere in the dark. I exhaled slowly and closed my eyes. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate movement. This time it was closer. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound stopped, but the silence wasn't normal anymore. It was heavier, pressed down on me. I felt like something was standing right outside the tent, watching, waiting. I reached for my flashlight. My hand shook as I gripped it, but I didn't turn it on yet. I listened for any other sounds. Nothing. I took a deep breath and switched on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the inside of my tent. I pointed it at the fabric walls, looking for shadows or movement outside. Still nothing. I swallowed hard and unzipped the tent just a little, just enough to peek out. The graveyard was exactly the same as before. No movement, no signs of life. I stepped out of the tent. The air was cold against my skin, but I ignored it. I swept the flashlight around, checking between the graves, behind the trees. There was no one. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was scaring myself. I crawled back into the tent and zipped it up tight. I lay there in the dark, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, waiting for sleep to come. And then I heard the breathing. It was right outside my tent. Slow, heavy breaths. Someone or something was standing inches away from me. I didn't move. My body felt frozen, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. The sound continued, steady and calm, like whatever was out there knew I wasn't going anywhere. Then the breathing stopped, and the tent moved. It was a small shift, barely anything, but I felt it. The fabric stretched inward, like a hand had pressed against it. I snapped. I unzipped the tent in one violent motion, shining the flashlight directly at whatever was outside. Nothing. The graveyard was empty.
No footprints.
No signs of movement. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my sleeping bag, my flashlight, and my knife, and I ran. I didn't pack up my tent. I didn't stop to check behind me. I just ran. The night was silent, but I could feel something watching me. I didn't know what. I didn't want to know. I ran until I was out of the graveyard, until I was back on the trail, until I saw the first hints of daylight breaking over the horizon. Only then did I stop. I stood there, breathless, heart pounding, staring back at the graveyard in the distance. It looked normal, ordinary. I don't know what was out there. I don't know what I heard, what I felt. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go back. I was no stranger to the woods. I had spent most of my life out there, cutting trees, hunting, and living off the land. The thick forest was where I felt at home, where the air was clean and the noise of the modern world couldn't reach me. It was the only place where I could think, where I could breathe without feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. It was late autumn when I decided to head out for a camping trip. I wanted a few days alone, away from everything. I packed up my truck with my usual gear: axe, rifle, sleeping bag, enough food for a week, though I planned to hunt as well. I had a spot deep in the woods, a place few people knew about. It was about a 4-hour drive from town, and then another hour on foot. There was an old logging trail leading most of the way, but it had been overgrown for years. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky was heavy with clouds, a dull gray stretching endlessly over the treetops. The air smelled like damp earth, like the promise of rain. I slung my pack over my shoulder, locked up the truck, and started walking. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. That was normal. The forest had its own rhythm, its own way of breathing. But something felt different this time. I couldn't place it at first, just a small feeling in the back of my head, like something wasn't right. I brushed it off and kept moving. By the time I reached my spot, the light was fading. I set up my tent near a small clearing, close to the edge of a creek. The water was running low, but it was clean. I collected some wood, built a fire, and sat down to eat. The warmth of the flames kept the cold away, and for a while, I let myself relax. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sounds of the forest, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the wind shifting through the trees. This was different. It was distant, but sharp, like something heavy moving through the woods. Slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. Nothing. I waited for a while, then went back to eating. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. They usually kept their distance, but it wasn't unheard of. The night stretched on, the fire burned low, and I finally crawled into my tent. The wind picked up, making the trees groan and sway. Somewhere far off, I heard the cry of a coyote. I closed my eyes and let the sound lull me to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not an animal. I knew that instantly. The footsteps were too slow, too heavy. Not cautious like a predator, not quick like a deer. Just slow, steady steps, circling my campsite. I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow across the clearing. I stayed still, listening, waiting. Then the steps stopped. I held my breath. Nothing. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't move. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, waiting for something else. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I lay back down, rifle close to my chest, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. The ground was damp from the night's rain. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Not much, just enough to notice. And then I saw them. Footprints. Human, but barefoot. The tracks circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. Then they led off into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. I felt a chill run through me. I had camped in these woods for years. I had never seen another person out this deep. It was too far from the main trails, too difficult to reach unless you knew exactly where you were going. I packed up my things quickly. My plan had been to stay for a few days, but something told me I needed to leave. I kept my rifle loaded, my axe strapped to my belt. As I hiked back, I kept checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never left. By the time I reached my truck, the sky had darkened again. Rain started falling as I threw my gear in the back. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the narrow road leading back to town, I glanced into my rearview mirror, and there, just at the edge of the trees, something moved. A figure, barefoot, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I never went back to that spot. I still camp, still spend time in the woods, but not there, never there. Some places are meant to be left alone. I had been planning the trip for months. Work had been a grind, and I needed a break. Something real, something away from the noise of people, phones, and emails. I wanted silence, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of a campfire. Nothing else. I found the spot on an old forum post. Some guy had mentioned a place deep in the woods, past a logging road that hadn't been used in years. No marked trails, no designated campsites, just pure wilderness. It sounded perfect. The only way in was a rough dirt path that barely passed as a road, and even then, you'd have to hike in the last few miles. It was late October, and the air was starting to cool. I packed my truck with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a rifle. Not because I was expecting trouble, but because it was bare country, and I wasn't taking any chances. The drive was long. I left town early in the morning, and by late afternoon, I was miles into nowhere. The road had turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, and then to something barely recognizable as a road at all. Trees loomed high on both sides, blocking out most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the more I started to notice the stillness. No cars, no other people, just the dull hum of my truck's engine. After another hour, I finally reached the spot where I had to continue on foot. I pulled over, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle in. I grabbed my backpack, shouldered my rifle, and started walking. The trail, or what was left of it, was overgrown. Bushes scraped against my pants, and tree branches snagged at my pack. I kept my pace steady, following the GPS on my phone. There was no service out here, but I had downloaded an offline map. The sun was already low by the time I found a good place to set up camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees, with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. A small creek ran nearby, its water barely making a sound as it trickled over rocks. I set up quickly, making sure everything was secure. The fire took a few tries, but soon enough, flames flickered against the darkening sky. I sat back, ate a quick meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. But as the hours passed and the night grew colder, something felt off. At first, I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. New surroundings always take some getting used to, but as I sat there, staring into the fire, I realized what was wrong. The woods were too quiet. I had been in the wilderness plenty of times before. At night, you hear things: crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. But here, there was nothing, just silence. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the forest was just naturally quiet at this time of year. But deep down, something in my gut told me otherwise. I double-checked my rifle, making sure it was loaded, then crawled into my tent. The fire was still burning outside, casting a soft glow against the fabric. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the unease creeping up my spine. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the wind. The steps were too steady, too controlled. I reached for my rifle, keeping my movements quiet. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon sniffing around for scraps. Then I heard it again, this time closer. I swallowed hard, gripping my rifle tighter. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay still, to listen. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing, my ears straining in the darkness. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, just when I started to think I had imagined it, something tapped against my tent. Not hard, just a single light tap, like a finger. I felt my blood run cold. I wanted to call out, to make my presence known, but I held back. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. Instead, I slowly, carefully, reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on, aiming it toward the tent wall. Nothing, just the smooth, undisturbed fabric. No shadows, no movement, but the feeling didn't go away. I lay there for hours, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and with it, a strange sense of unease. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, and scanned the area. My fire had burned low, leaving only smoldering embers. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, untouched except for... I froze. Footprints. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled my tent once before disappearing into the trees. A chill ran down my spine. I was miles from the nearest road. No one should have been out here. No one but me. I tried to think logically. Maybe a hiker had wandered through. Maybe they saw my tent and got curious. But that didn't explain the tapping. I made up my mind then and there. I was leaving. I packed quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. My heart pounded as I stomped out the fire, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started back toward my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, just beyond the trees. But there was never anyone there. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, relief flooded through me. But then I stopped. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the area. The truck was untouched otherwise. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. Just the door hanging open. I didn't waste time. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the trail, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, until the trees thinned and the world felt normal again. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back, never tried to figure out who or what had been out there with me. All I know is that I wasn't alone, and whoever it was, they wanted me to know it. I had been planning the trip for weeks. A solo camping weekend in the hills of Northumberland, away from everything, work, People, noise. I wanted the isolation, the silence, the space to breathe. I had done this kind of thing before, but always in more well-known spots, places where there was at least some chance of bumping into another camper or a hiker. This time, I had chosen something more remote. I had found the location through an old map. A barely marked clearing deep in the woods, miles from any proper trails, far from the usual campsites. It was supposed to be untouched, forgotten, a place where no one really went anymore. That was the appeal. I arrived early in the afternoon, parked my car at a lay-by off a single-track road, and hiked in with my gear. The trees swallowed the last signs of civilization behind me, and soon it was just me and the forest. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the sound of birds faded until all I could hear was the wind through the branches and the crunch of my boots on damp earth. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the spot. A small clearing, surrounded by dense woodland. The ground was soft, covered in moss and old leaves, and there was a narrow stream trickling nearby. Felt untouched, exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked an easy meal. As the sun dipped, the cold crept in fast, the kind of damp chill that settles deep in your bones. I wrapped up, sat by the fire, and let the silence settle around me. That's when I noticed it. Something felt off. At first, I couldn't place it. Just a feeling, a slight shift in the air, a pressure at the back of my skull. I told myself it was nothing, just the quiet messing with me. But then I realized something had changed. The forest had gone silent. Not just quieter, but completely dead. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals. Just nothing. I scanned the tree line. My fire cast long shadows, flickering against the trunks, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The feeling stayed, though, like being watched. I shook it off, probably just my mind playing tricks. I had been alone for hours, maybe my brain was reacting to that. I forced myself to relax, added more wood to the fire, and eventually climbed into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside. A branch snapping, a shuffle of movement. But every time I listened, there was only silence. At some point, I must have drifted off because when I woke up again, it was pitch black. And this time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was something moving outside, not an animal. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Slow, measured steps circling my tent. I lay completely still, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers, not enough to see anything clearly. I reached for my knife, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then, a sound that turned my stomach to ice. Breathing, just outside my tent. Slow, deep, deliberate. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle in my body locked. The fabric of the tent was thin. If someone wanted to get in, there was nothing stopping them. I waited, listened, tried to make sense of it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, every nerve on edge, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the first hints of dawn crept through the trees. I forced myself to move, to unzip the tent just enough to see outside. Nothing. The fire was cold, the clearing empty. No footprints, no disturbed ground. Just the forest, silent and still, like nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I packed up fast, stuffing my gear into my bag, constantly checking over my shoulder. The feeling hadn't left. I had been watched. I had been followed. I had heard something that shouldn't have been there, and I wasn't waiting around to see if it came back. The hike out was the longest I had ever done. Every snap of a branch, every shift of shadows had me on edge. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I reached my car, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. Only when I was miles away, back on proper roads, did I finally breathe. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know. But I never went camping alone again, and I never went back to that place. I had been working as a cop for over 10 years when I decided to take a short break. It wasn't an official vacation, just a few days off to clear my head. The job had started to wear me down. Long shifts, the constant weight of responsibility, the things I had seen. I needed some space to breathe, away from the city, away from people. I chose to go camping in a forest I had visited before years ago. It was about a 3-hour drive from home, far enough to feel isolated but close enough that I could get back if I needed to. The place wasn't a tourist attraction, just a stretch of deep woods with an old, barely used dirt road leading in. The last time I had been there, I had camped near a small, slow-moving river, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the sky. It had been peaceful, exactly what I needed now. I packed light, just the basics. A tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, a knife, and my sidearm. I never went anywhere unarmed, especially not in the middle of nowhere. Even out here, there was always the chance of running into trouble, whether it was a wild animal or something else. I reached the forest late in the afternoon. The road leading in was just as rough as I remembered, filled with potholes and half covered by fallen leaves and branches. I drove slowly, watching for anything that might puncture a tire. After about 20 minutes of navigating the narrow path, I reached a clearing where I could park. I got out and stretched, breathing in the cool air. It was quiet, just the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of running water. I grabbed my pack and locked the truck before heading toward the river. The spot I had in mind was another 15-minute walk from where I had parked, but I didn't mind. I wanted to be deep enough into the woods that I wouldn't see or hear anyone. As I walked, I noticed how overgrown everything had become. The path I had taken last time was barely visible, the trees and underbrush thicker than I remembered. It made the place feel even more isolated, like no one had been out here in years. By the time I reached the river, the sun was starting to set. I found a flat spot near the water and started setting up my tent. It took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven, and I had to clear away a few fallen branches, but eventually, I got everything in place. Once the tent was up, I gathered some wood and started a fire. I sat by it, eating a simple meal, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that settled into your bones once the sun went down. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and watched the fire flicker. Felt good to be alone. No radios, no paperwork, no calls in the middle of the night. Just me, the woods, and the sound of the river. But as the night went on, I started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sense that something was wrong. The kind of feeling I had learned to trust on the job. My instincts had saved my life more than once, and right now they were telling me to be alert. I glanced around, scanning the tree line. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was nothing but darkness. I listened carefully, trying to pick out anything unusual. At first, I heard nothing but the wind and the water. But then something else, a branch snapping. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I turned my head slowly, focusing on the direction of the sound. Then silence. I stayed still, waiting. Sometimes it was just an animal passing through. Other times it was something else. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the trees, but there were no more sounds. I let out a slow breath and reached for my gun, keeping it close, just in case. I stayed up longer than I had planned, watching the darkness, listening. But nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself to get into the tent. I zipped it up, keeping my weapon within reach, and lay down. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound had me on edge. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, it was early morning. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was quiet. I sat up and stretched, my back sore from the hard ground. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air. That's when I saw it. Footprints. They weren't mine. The tracks were fresh, leading from the tree line to just a few feet away from my tent. They were spaced out like someone had been walking slowly, carefully. I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. Whoever had been here was gone. I followed the tracks, moving cautiously. They led toward the trees but disappeared after a short distance. The ground was covered in leaves, making it hard to see where they had gone. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I checked my gear, making sure nothing was missing. Everything was where I had left it, but that didn't make me feel any better. Whoever had come this close hadn't been trying to rob me. They had just been there, watching. I packed up my things quickly. I had planned to stay another night, but that wasn't happening now. I wasn't about to sit around and wait to see who would come back. As I made my way back to the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound, every movement made my pulse jump. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw something that stopped me cold. My truck. The driver's side door was open. I was sure I had locked it. I pulled my gun and approached slowly, checking around the vehicle. No one was there. I looked inside. Nothing was missing, but on the driver's seat, there was something that hadn't been there before. A single old key, rusted, worn. I picked it up carefully, my mind racing. Who had been out here, and why leave this? I scanned the tree line one last time before getting into the truck and locking the doors. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, driving faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, the trees fading into the distance behind me. I never went back to that place. I never figured out who had been there, watching me in the dark. And I never found out what that key was for. But I still have it. And sometimes I wonder if someone is waiting for me to use it. It had been a long time since I last went camping. Life had kept me busy, and I hadn't had a reason to pack up and head out into the woods like I used to. But when my cousin Jason called me up and told me he wanted to spend a weekend outdoors, away from everything, I figured it would be a good idea. We both grew up spending time in the woods, hunting, fishing, setting up camp deep in the trees where no one else would bother us. We picked a spot far from town, somewhere off the main roads where we wouldn't run into other campers. Jason said he'd found an old logging road that led to a small clearing near a river. It was the perfect spot, quiet, isolated, with enough tree cover to keep the wind down. The weather had been decent all week, but the forecast called for rain that night. We didn't care. We'd camped in the rain before, and we knew how to set up properly. We packed tarps, extra clothes, and made sure our tents were waterproof. It was supposed to be a short trip, just 2 nights, long enough to get away, enjoy the quiet, and maybe do a little fishing. The drive out took nearly 3 hours. The road leading to the spot was rough, barely a road at all, more like a pair of deep ruts cutting through the trees. The further we went, the less traveled it looked. Grass grew thick in the middle of the path, and fallen branches littered the way. At one point, I had to get out and move a downed tree just so we could keep going. When we finally arrived, the spot was just as Jason described, small, but enough space for the truck and our tents. The river was about 50 yards away, cutting through the woods like a dark ribbon. Tall pines loomed over us, their branches thick enough to block out the sky. We set up quickly. The tents went up first, then a tarp over the fire pit in case the rain started early. We gathered firewood, stacking enough to last through the night. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain, but there was no wind, no sign of a storm rolling in just yet. By the time the fire was going, the sun had started dipping below the trees. The temperature dropped fast. We cooked some food, ate, and sat back, watching the fire burn low. That was when we heard the first sound. It was faint, distant, something moving in the woods beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it was just the normal sounds of the forest. Animals moving through the brush, twigs snapping under their weight. But this was different. It wasn't random. It wasn't the occasional rustle of leaves or the scurry of a small animal. It was steady, deliberate. Jason noticed it too. I could tell by the way he kept glancing toward the trees, his face half lit by the fire. We didn't say anything. There was no need to. We both knew the woods, knew how to listen. The sounds continued, slow, rhythmic, too heavy for a deer, too controlled for something like a raccoon. The fire crackled, sending up a spray of sparks. I turned my head just slightly, keeping my eyes on the dark spaces between the trees. Then it stopped. Everything went quiet. The normal sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, faded into complete silence. I don't know how long we sat there, staring into the darkness. Maybe a minute, maybe more. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, we heard it. A single sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Jason and I both stood at the same time. My heart pounded against my ribs. I scanned the tree line, trying to make out any movement. Nothing, but I could feel it. Something was there. We grabbed our flashlights and pointed them toward the trees. The beams cut through the dark, lighting up the trunks, the undergrowth, but nothing else. Still, I felt it. We stood there, frozen, waiting. The fire popped behind us, but otherwise, the silence held. Then the rain started. A light drizzle at first, tapping against the tarp, soaking into the ground. Within minutes, it was pouring. Jason turned back toward the fire, tossing more wood on to keep it from dying out. I kept my flashlight aimed at the trees. The feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now. We decided to turn in early. The rain made it miserable to sit outside, and neither of us felt comfortable staying by the fire. I climbed into my tent, zipped the door shut, and listened. The rain drummed against the fabric, loud enough to drown out most other sounds. But underneath it, I swore I could hear something moving. I barely slept. Every little sound had me wide awake, gripping the knife I kept in my sleeping bag. Then, sometime in the early morning hours, I heard it again. Closer this time. Heavy footsteps. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath. The rain poured, masking the world beyond the thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there. Then the zipper moved. Not fast, not yanked open, just a slight tug. I bolted upright, grabbing my flashlight and flicking it on. Nothing. I listened. The rain covered up most noises, but the heavy feeling in my chest told me something was still there. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard Jason's tent unzip. Not fast, not in a way that made sense. Slow, deliberate. I threw my flashlight beam toward his tent. The zipper was halfway down, but I couldn't see inside. I didn't move. Then, after what felt like forever, the zipper moved back up. Slow. It closed completely. I wanted to call out to Jason, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I stayed frozen, gripping my knife, waiting. The rain kept falling. The feeling didn't go away. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was rising, the rain had stopped, and everything felt normal again. Jason stepped out of his tent, rubbing his eyes. I stared at him. He stared back. Neither of us said a word. We packed up quickly. No breakfast, no fire. Just threw everything into the truck and left. We never talked about it. Never went back to that spot. But I know what I felt that night. And I know Jason felt it too. Because when I finally got the courage to ask him about it, months later, he just shook his head and said, "I never unzipped my tent." And that was the last time we ever camped together. There you go. Ultra long, highly detailed, and as realistic as possible. Let me know if you want another one with a different scenario. I had always liked camping alone. It was something I had done since I was a teenager, and even in my late 30s, it remained a way to clear my mind. I had been living in France for the past few years, working remotely, and took every chance I could to head out into nature. That summer, I decided to camp in the forests near the Pyrenees, a little off the usual hiking trails. I had done my research and picked an area that wasn't too remote but still quiet enough to avoid crowds. I planned to camp for 3 nights before heading back to the small town where I had parked my car. I arrived in the late afternoon, the warm air carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows as I hiked. My pack was heavy with supplies, enough food, a sturdy tent, a good sleeping bag, and a small camping stove. I had been in these types of forests before, and nothing about them felt unusual. It was just another camping trip. By the time I reached a suitable clearing, the sun was low in the sky. It was a good spot. Flat ground, no immediate signs of wildlife, and a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a simple meal. As darkness settled in, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. The first night was uneventful. I woke up early, had some coffee, and spent the day hiking around the area. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick undergrowth, but nothing seemed out of place. I saw a few deer tracks, some birds, and the usual signs of small animals, but no people. It was exactly what I had wanted, quiet and isolated. It was on the second evening that I first noticed something strange. As I was sitting by the fire, I had the feeling I was being watched. It was that subtle awareness that you can't quite explain, like the sensation of eyes on you even when you can't see anyone. I glanced around, but the forest was dark beyond the fire's glow. The feeling didn't go away, but I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had camped alone countless times, and paranoia could creep in when you were deep in the woods. I went to bed, making sure to zip up my tent tightly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what had disturbed me at first, but then I heard it. A faint rustling just outside the tent. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the undergrowth, but something deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been a fox or some other small animal. I turned over and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. There were no obvious signs of anything unusual, no footprints, no disturbed areas. I still couldn't shake the feeling, though. By midday, I decided to move to a different spot, about a mile deeper into the woods. It wasn't a huge distance, but I figured if there had been someone nearby, they wouldn't know where I had gone. That night, I made sure my fire was burning a little longer before putting it out. I sat outside my tent for a while, listening carefully. The forest was normal, branches creaking, the occasional distant movement of an animal. Nothing strange. I eventually went into the tent, zipped myself in, and laid down, but I couldn't relax. I felt on edge, like I was waiting for something to happen, and then it did. It started with soft footsteps. Not from an animal, these were slow, deliberate. My whole body went tense. The steps circled my tent, crunching softly on the forest floor. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again, circling. I felt trapped. My knife was in my bag, just out of reach. My headlamp was next to me, but I didn't want to turn it on and give away that I was awake. The footsteps stopped. I listened, my heart hammering in my ears. I was certain someone was standing just outside my tent. Minutes passed. Then I heard a quiet but unmistakable sound, the slow, deliberate unzipping of my tent door. I shot up, grabbed my headlamp, and switched it on. The beam of light illuminated the fabric, but the tent door wasn't open. I must have imagined the sound. Then something pressed against the tent wall. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just sat there staring. The pressure disappeared. The silence stretched on. I don't know how long I sat there before exhaustion took over. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to daylight filtering through the fabric. I unzipped the tent carefully, stepping outside with my knife in hand. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints. Someone had been standing there. I packed up immediately. The hike back to my car felt endless. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me. The feeling of being watched never left. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got in and drove away without looking back. I never went camping alone again.